Okay, everyone. What we got here is I decided to set up an example of gameplay, and rather than simply play an adventure where you watch my guy eating, or you watch my guy trying to buy clothes or supplies, or you watch my guy getting lost, I decided to give you an example of combat in Journey to the Overland. Now, what we have going on here is I've set up a scenario where this character here, who is Rolf, was left to guard this ship, and they've landed in what is called the Unknown Islands, which is actually a location in the game. And while the rest of his crew is off raiding or exploring, he gets attacked by 3 scouts from the local tribe, and so a combat sets up. And I imagine basically he was kind of off watching the pass up here. He comes down and notices the scouts. Now, we're not going to be using just the standard combat in Journey to the Overland. I decided for this example to also show what is called the optional facing rules. And so you see I created a little template here to represent the hexes. So normally you could set this up on the actual map, which is why we went with the 1-inch hexes, because there are times you will want to set up positions of figures. But if you want to create an overlay like this, you could do that, or else you could set it up actually on a large hex map or hex sheet, like I've got my table sitting on. But having said that, let's get right into it. So first of all, let's look at Rolf's characteristics and what he's working with. So I designed Rolf before I set everything up. Rolf is a 60% warrior, 75% berserker. He has an ability score of 72 and endurance of 78. He's wearing a coat of chainmail with an absorb of 10, the maximum absorb of 40. And I'll explain how armor works when we get to that point. He's got a heavy fur coat. He's got an axe that's kind of small, so it's really a double-headed axe. For purposes of the rules, I kind of classified it as a hand axe, but it gives him a +8 modifier, does -17 damage. He also has a dagger, which you can't see, but it may come in handy during the combat, and so I just wanted to point that out. He's facing 3 tribesmen, so this will be 1, the guy with no mask, 2 is the guy with the brown mask, 3 is the guy with the yellow mask. The tribesmen have shields. The one in the middle I classified as a large shield, the other 2 are small, so they add +10 to defensive modifiers. They have spears, which for purposes of the rules I classified as javelins, because they're more streamlined than a heavy spear that a typical medieval soldier would have used. Their ability score is 60 and their endurance score is 55. Now that's one thing I'll point out. In most combats, all you're really going to need is the character's ability score and endurance score. Sometimes their agility, if you're trying to see who goes first, because usually whoever has the highest agility will attack first. But so even though there's a lot of characteristics given with each of the characters, normally for combat, those are the only 2 you need. Now, because we're using the optional facing rules, this is how you would set up characters using those rules when the player character is outnumbered. The first 3 characters that he faces will always be to his front, and if there was more than 3, they'd be back here, but they always start to his front. Because the whole purpose of the optional facing rules is an attempt to get to the side, or worse yet, behind your opponent. Because if his NPCs get behind him, they're going to be able to do massive damage. And for these guys, that's important because their javelins only really do -3 damage, which most of that will not get through his armor initially. So they're going to have to try to get behind him, because using the optional facing rules, if they're able to get behind him, for example, let me see, they do an extra -10 damage. So that's very large. They go from doing -3 damage to actual -13 damage. And then actually they're going to not only break through that armor, but they're going to deplete his armor very quickly. So the first thing you decide when you do a combat is who's going to attack first, who's going to defend. For this scenario, I'm going to assume that Rolf here was surprised. So I'm going to give these NPCs the right to attack first or defend first. Now, whenever you do a combat, you have to decide whether you're going to attack or you're going to defend. And for NPCs, it'll usually be spelled out what they'll choose to do, but normally they're going to always attack unless they get down to half their wounds. So that's all you got to kind of remember. So, starting with number 1, since we're using the optional facing rules, the first thing I have to do is roll to see which way they're going to move toward him. So I take my basic 2d10s. I'm going to use the 7 as my 10s and the black as my 1s. So I rolled a 77. So looking that up in the optional facing rules, if you roll a 77, it says that your opponent remains in his current position. So he's going to remain in his current position. So let's resolve his attack, because rather than moving them all first, you want to move, do their attack, then do the next one's move and attack. And that's going to be kind of important, because as wounds pile up, it may decide what your guy wants to do. If this guy misses him, for example, and then this guy attacks, he might want to turn and face him because he knows this guy has already missed, so he's not worried about turning his back to this guy. Whereas if you wait and try to do their moves, you know, he can be in an untenable position. So for these rules, you're going to resolve them one at a time. So we see that he has +10 javelin. Their ability score is 60, so that gives them a 70. He rolled a 90, so that's a miss. So we go to the next guy, number 2. Let's see what he decides to do. So I roll a 14. So on the NPC movement table for the optional combat rules, if you roll a 14, that means he faces you forward. So he's already there. So he's going to essentially stay there. He attacks again, needing less than 70. He rolls a 10. So he rolls a 10. If he has a javelin, it gives -3 damage. Now here's where armor comes in. Rolf's armor absorbs 10. So the first 10 points of any damage is absorbed by his armor, meaning it doesn't get subtracted from his endurance. It does, however, get subtracted from his armor. So unlike a lot of games, armor is not indefinite. It gets wore down. It gets beat down. So his armor had a maximum absorb of 40. You now -3 from his armor. The maximum absorb of his armor is now 37. So that means eventually these guys can whittle him down and he won't have much armor left. And that's very important. So armor, unlike a lot of games in Journey to the Overland, armor is not perpetual. It's not like, well, once you got this armor, no one's ever going to get through it. Even the weakest guys eventually will chip your armor, find holes or kinks in it, or even just crack it and destroy it. So we go to number 3. Let's see what he's going to do. So that's a 89. So, and I'm looking at the optional facing rules, and 89, it says he turns all the way around or he faces the opposite direction, which for this means he tries to move, he's going to try to move behind Rolf. So, and in Journey to the Overland, the basic move for a human being that's not mounted is 2 spaces. So that means he's going to move his maximum movement amount 2 spaces in an attempt to try to get behind Rolf, which in this example, we move him 1, 2. Now, one thing in the optional facing rules is every character takes turn moving and pivoting. Unless, of course, you're outnumbered, in which case you're pretty much going to get to pivot. So Rolf can actually pivot his maximum movement. So since he's facing forward, his maximum pivot is 2, because that's his maximum movement. So he can go left or right. If he had enough, he could go all the way around. So in this instance, he's going to pivot 1, which would face this guy, and then 2, which would face this guy. But guess what? The first 3 hexes in front of you are considered your front. So unfortunately, the warrior didn't get to Roth's back. Roth turned to face him and is now in the same position he was before. But this is also important to show that why you don't want to do the movement then all of their attacks. You do them one at a time, because he gets to pivot in response to what every one of these guys does. So let's do his attack. 47, that's another hit. Again, it's going to be absorbed by the armor, but the armor is now down to 37 minus 3. His armor is now down to 34. So I'm keeping track of this off camera. Okay, now we're going to do Roth's attack. Because Roth is a warrior, other than a lot of the other warrior abilities, the only one I'm really going to focus on for this is, as a warrior, he gets to attack twice in combat. So he can either choose to hit this guy twice, or he can now choose to attack each of them once. So Roth is going to decide to attack each of them once and try to whittle them down. He's got a ability of 72. He's got a +8 axe, so that puts him up to 80. He's doing minus 17 damage. Now, there's modifiers in the combat based on things you do. So, for example, I believe Roth moved or turned in his action, even though his opponent didn't make an evade action. So, but there's no modifier for that. An evade is a separate action. So Roth right now has no modifier. So we're going to do his first attack on number 3 here. He needs less than 80. He's got a 45. He did minus 17 damage. Now, his endurance, number 3, their endurance is 55. They have no armor on, obviously, so he's going to take that whole 17 damage from his 55. So 55 minus 17 is 38. So his endurance is already down to 38. Roth then attacks this one here, which is 1. He hits again, so that will put number 1's endurance down to 38. Okay, and so that ends our first round of combat. This is the position after the first round of combat. And that's important because there's certain rules that, depending on what round of combat you're in, on how NPCs will react. So we go to the second round of combat, and now it's going to alternate. So you don't roll for initiative. It's just, he had his turn, it goes back to their turn, and it'll go back and forth unless you've got a skill or ability that changes that. So we go back to 1. He's attacking with his javelin again. Let's see where he decides to go if he tries to get behind Roth. So he rolls a 1. So it says here, on a roll of 1 through 50, the NPC will move toward your character's front. So for some reason he decides to get back in front of him. Maybe he's trying to distract him or whatever. So that's which way he goes. We roll his attack. He doesn't have wounds equal to half his endurance, otherwise he'd have a modifier. So he's still going to get his 60 plus 10 for the javelin is 70. Wow, he hit it right on the nose. So that takes another 3 off of the armor. And you can see why it's real important that they try to get behind Roth, because he's just going to mow them down. If they don't get behind him, or even get to the side of him, where they would get plus 5 damage, he's going to mow them down before long. So he's down to, his armor's down to 31. We do the next guy. He tries to go to the front. So now everybody's going to the front. 1, 2. So they're basically in this same hex. He attacks him. I believe he has a 60 plus 10. So he misses altogether. The last guy, this is the only guy that seems like he knows how to try to get behind somebody. Well, that's cocked. So 4, he moves to the front. So they all decide to move to the front, to just say, look, maybe they're just going to try to rush him. So I'm going to depict this like that. I mean, so now this guy moves to the front. Let's see what he gets. He misses. He gets an 85. So now Rolf doesn't have to pivot at all this turn. He's got his warrior skill. And just for the sake of shits and giggles, he's going to put both of his attacks on this guy to the front, which is number 1. Because if he hits, he's going to kill this guy real quick. So Rolf has his ability of 72 plus 8 axe. He's at an 80 for his first attack. Wow, that's a big hit. 19. Now, Rolf is a berserker, and all berserkers have what's called a berserk score, which means if you roll that exact number in combat, they go berserk. And the berserk score is going to always be less than your ability score, which means you won't go berserk on a failed attack. His berserk score is actually 21. So that 19 was real close to him going berserk, because if he goes berserk, it's going to be a bad day for all 3 of these guys. But he's still composed. Anyway, he hits. He does another 17 damage, which I believe he was at 38. So that's going to take him down to 21. Okay, so now he's down to less than his half of his endurance, which means he's going to start trying to do a defensive action every other turn. So that means his shield will come into play if he survives. But Rolf doesn't plan on letting him survive. Attacks again. Another 17, 18, 19, 21. His endurance is down to 4. If your endurance gets below 10 in the game, you go unconscious. So this guy is not necessarily dead, but he's out of the action. He's unconscious. So these 2 are here, and basically that was Rolf's turn. He's already taken one of these guys out, and his armor hasn't even been depleted yet. This is fun. So let's see what number 2 is going to do now. So he gets to 39. Again, that means he moves to the front, which is where he's at, so he stays there. He rolls his attack. He hits, takes off another 3 from the armor. So it goes from 31 to 28. So Rolf's armor's down to 28. And the other guy, number 3, wow, 94. So he's going to move to the back. He's not crazy. He's like, screw this. So he goes 1, 2. And that would actually be considered like a side, the rear. I think that would actually be the side or the rear. If I check my table, I got an illustration here. So that's considered his right side. So that's not the back. The back would be this one right here. So he didn't have enough movement to get all the way behind him. But because this guy has already attacked and is right here, Rolf can respond to his movement by pivoting 1 and 2. He turns and faces him. It's not easy to get behind a person, okay, and that's in reality. Most people are not going to let somebody get behind them, and that's the way this system was designed, is to make it so that in almost every instance, if a person can turn to face you, they're going to do that. So anyway, they're facing forward again, no bonus. His attack, and he misses. Oh my goodness. So we're going to start the next round. That's the end of round 1. We go to round 2. Actually, neither of these guys have half their wounds per se, so they're going to still choose attack actions. So we're going to go to this guy because 1 is out. So number 2 will get his. Let's see what he does. He's going to move to the front again. For some reason, maybe these warriors have a code that they won't attack somebody from the back other than this guy. So we roll for his attack. He hits, another 3 points of damage. The armor's down to 25. I mean, I guess I can keep track of that. I don't think it's going to make a big difference in a minute here. And now, this guy here, just to show you how the rule works, he's going to choose a defense action this turn. So he can still get his movement. in optional movement, so he stays to the front. But he's going to choose a defense. And so in order to do defense, you roll the dice. You know, there's no defense score. It's whatever you roll. So he has a 72. You add any defensive weapons or shields. His shield, which is actually considered a small shield, will give him a +10. That's an 82. So now that it's Rolf's attack, Rolf will have to subtract 82 from what his normal attack would be. So Rolf has a 72 score with a +80 axe. So he cannot hit this guy. So, you know, you probably want to do that once Rolf decides what he's going to do, you know, because I guess Rolf could put both his attacks on this guy. And let's just assume, you know, this guy is cowering up and he's shielding Rolf, and Rolf sees that. So he decides, look, I'll take this guy out first rather than try to get through his guard. So as a warrior, he gets his 2 strikes. That's 57. That's a hit. So that'll do another 17 damage, taking him down to 21. Another attack by Rolf. That's cocked. He just needs 80 or less. And this guy's now unconscious. Okay. So now it's just Rolf and the other warrior here. And Rolf is no worse for the wear. But because he did a defense action last turn, he can't do one again this turn. They will only do him every other round of combat. So in this round, we roll for his movement, 85. He tries to get behind again. This guy is trying his best to get behind Rolf. But of course, that's not going to work. Rolf gets his 2 pivot. 1, 2. Now, one thing that's important in this is if he was on a horse or mounted, and they have, most horses or mounts have like movements of 3 or 4, he could actually outmaneuver Rolf after a while, because you notice Rolf can only pivot 2. If he was able to have moved 3 or so, he would eventually be able to get behind Rolf, because once he got to the back, he could stop. He wouldn't have to go his whole 3. But, you know, basically both of them being on foot, Rolf can just keep responding to whichever way this guy goes. So he's going to get his last futile attempt to say, look, we're going to chip your armor down, and then when the rest of the tribe gets here, you're not going to be able to benefit from it. And so they do. The armor is now down to 22. And that can be important in the game. You know, if you're caught out traveling and you've got great armor, but you come into a battle like this that you're probably not going to lose the battle, but they do some damage to your armor, you can become vulnerable real quick. So Rolf attacks. He gets a 41. It's another 17 off. A 60. Another 17, and he's unconscious. And at the end of the day, Rolf stands undefeated.